Our final session of today, live and in person, is we're going to go back to game theory and maths questions around looking at an analysis of p+epsilon attacks on Schelling game-based systems by, this is William George from Kleros. Thank you.
So while they're getting that set up, so as said, my name is William George. My background is as a mathematician. So before working for Kleros, I was in academia, and now I work for the startup, which is building a blockchain-based dispute resolution system. And in particular, this blockchain-based dispute resolution system is based on something called a Schelling game. So I do a lot of research on like what are the possible attack vectors on these games, like what kind of design choices can we make to make them more resistant. And this talk is going to be on one specific type of attack on these kinds of games, and sort of like the design space that goes into resistance there. So briefly, what's a Schelling game? So a Schelling point is this idea, or a focal point, is this idea introduced by Thomas Schelling, who was an economist, who talked about these sort of ideas of how people coordinate when they don't communicate with each other. And his thought experiment he liked to give when he was describing what a Schelling point is imagine that two people want to meet in New York City today. Or maybe tomorrow, but they don't know when or where they're supposed to meet with each other. They want to meet each other, but they're not communicating, they don't know where and when to meet. And Schelling found empirically that most of them would try to meet each other, or a large disproportionate percentage would try to meet each other at Grand Central Station, at the information booth at noon. And there's nothing particularly special about Grand Central Station, the information booth at noon. Like any place in New York City, any time would have worked. But noon is this like distinguished time, and Grand Central Station has this like history and like role as a meeting place. So people tended to go there expecting other people to go there. And Schelling described this idea of the Schelling point as a solution that people will tend to use in the absence of communication because it seems natural, special, or relevant to them. And then roughly I would I'd define a Schelling game as like a coordination game. People have a payoff matrix where they're paid more if they coordinate with each other, they're penalized if they don't coordinate. Where there's an option which is distinguished not because the payoff matrix distinguishes it, but because of like external or cultural reasons. Okay, so in Kleros, we use this for a dispute resolution system. So there are lots of like blockchain oracles. There are many cryptoeconomic systems that use this in some way or another. But sort of the example that might occur for Kleros would be that like maybe I have two people, like someone has a small business, they hired a freelancer. If they're unhappy with the freelancer's work, they would want to like have dispute resolution. And then the way that works in Kleros is that there are a bunch of crowdsourced jurors that are picked to rule on the dispute. And without going into like the details of how like the jurors are selected and things like that, the point is the jurors are incentivized via a Schelling mechanism. So the jurors are rewarded if they agree with the ultimate outcome with what the other jurors say. They're penalized if they disagree. So each juror is like, well, I look at the case. I think that Alice is probably right. So I think the other jurors are more likely to think that Alice is right than not because they're more likely than not to come to the same kind of conclusion as I am. And then I think the other jurors are going to vote for Alice, if only because they think I'm going to vote for Alice. And then ideally they all vote for Alice. And so, okay, that's all great. So there are a variety of attack vectors that we consider in our research at Kleros. But there's one interesting one that I will talk about now called a p+epsilon attack, which tries to warp the incentive structure of a Schelling game specifically. So it says, okay, you have this nice payoff matrix where you get P if you vote for X and X wins, and you get P if you vote for Y and Y wins, but otherwise you don't get anything. What if an attacker comes along that wants Y to win? And the attacker offers to people the unusual bribe that if you vote Y, but X wins, I will give you p+epsilon. And then you as a voter are like, well, if X wins and I vote X, I get P, that's great. But if I vote Y, I get a little more, I get p+epsilon. And if I vote Y, if Y wins and I vote Y, well then I'm coherent, so I get rewarded for that. And if I don't vote for Y, then I'm penalized. So it's a dominant strategy, it's a weakly dominant strategy to vote for Y. So this attack is actually very insidious because you can imagine that if an attacker can credibly commit to a p+epsilon attack, they're just like, I have a p+epsilon attack available. Maybe they enforce that with a smart contract. Then the voters are going to be like, well, it's dominant strategy for me to vote with the attacker, so I'll vote for the attacker, but then the attacker wins, and the attacker doesn't pay anything, because that's what happens if the attacker wins. So this looks like a free attack, so that's really disconcerting. So before I continue on, there's one sort of like note here that will be a little more important later. That there's an equilibrium where everyone just votes with the attacker. There's one other equilibrium, or there is another equilibrium, where if you think you have the deciding vote, if you're the tipping point, well, then you'll get P either way. You can't get the bribe. If you vote X, X will win, you'll be coherent. If you vote Y, Y will win, you'll be coherent. Like maybe the other people will get bribes, but you won't. So like you could then pick either one, and like that you can fall into an equilibrium like that. So this attack was like sort of really introduced in this blog article by Vitalik Buterin, in which he credits Andrew Miller for coming up with the attack. So I hope he's watching on the live stream and provides comments. So in the blog article, Vitalik analyzes this specific payoff structure that I showed before, where there's a constant payoff for if you're coherent. There are live systems that use that. Schelling coin was a proposed system that basically used that. There are a number of blockchain oracles that do this. And notably, interestingly, as pointed out in Vitalik's blog article, proof of work is basically this. Because if I'm a miner and I'm like, okay, I want to mine, like a fork just appeared. I don't know which fork to mine. I want to mine one of the two forks. Maybe there's this like attacker offering a bribe for one of the two forks. And I just want to mine on the fork that's going to eventually win, because that way I get a block reward. And if I mine on the wrong fork, I just waste my electricity. I don't get a block reward. So that payoff structure is exactly the simple Schelling game. And then in terms of other past work, so again, the blog article sort of is like the pioneering resource here. There are a couple of other interesting academic articles that have done like taxonomies of different kinds of attacks, particularly on proof-of-stake systems, that talk a little bit about p+epsilon attacks. There's this interesting article down here at the bottom, where this like law of economics, where someone points out that there are actually a few instances of people doing attacks like this in share acquisition company, like traditional company buying, which is interesting. But there's not been a whole lot of research on this, so it's worth further looking into. And one more just sort of piece of past work. So there's an interesting thought experiment introduced by, written in an editorial by Warren Buffett in 2000, where he criticizes US campaign finance reform. And he proposes, what if just some eccentric billionaire, quotes, not me, offered the following bribe. Like, I'll give $1 billion to the political party that provides the most votes for campaign finance reform, assuming that campaign finance reform fails. So this is like a kind of a p+epsilon attack with the cute property that, like, if campaign finance reform passes, well, then the crazy billionaire can't pay the bribe anymore because, well, their campaign finance laws now. So this whole idea of the only paying the bribe if the attack fails is like built into the thought experiment. So that's cute. So in our work, one thing we've done, or we've asked ourselves, is what happens if I change the structure of the payoff matrix? Like, there are other kinds of Schelling games one could make. There are other coordination games, and what happens if I change the payoff matrix of my coordination game? What happens compared to the analysis in the blog article? So one model that I look at is something I call a redistributive Schelling game. So here, there's basically, there's like a total amount that's being split between the coherent jurors. So rather than having these constant payoffs, now if other people are incoherent and I'm coherent, I get more, because I get whatever the incoherent people didn't get. So there's like a total amount of money, NP, which is being input into the systems, being split between the coherent people. And also, like, there's minus Ds, people are allowed to lose a deposit. So I might get the deposits of incoherent people as well. So Kleros uses this system. Also, if you look at proof of work, like before I said proof of work was kind of a simple Schelling game, but it can also kind of be seen like a redistributive Schelling game if you squint your eyes. Because imagine that you're at a long time scale and the difficulty is readjusting continuously. Then if I'm mining on like a fork by myself, usually that's not a very good idea, but say I'm mining just a fork by myself, then the difficulty will adjust to the point, eventually, where I'm basically getting a fixed amount of block rewards per unit time. I'll get like if I'm mining by myself for a week, I'll get 1 week's worth of block rewards. And then if somehow like that fork comes back and wins, I get all of those rewards. So I've gotten all the rewards that anybody could have taken a share of if they'd been mining on that fork, but I got them all because I was the only person there. So that's a redistributive structure. And one other model is what I call a symbiotic Schelling game, where now if there's this agreement, everybody gets less. So it's like the opposite of a redistributive Schelling game. Again, M is the number of voters, D is like a deposit people put in. And this is proposed, the last time I checked, for the sort of payoff structure for the ETH 2.0% Serenity release. And they argue they should use this to like avoid discouragement attacks, that they have their reasons. But now, there's this opposite property that like, with a redistributive Schelling game, if I want sort of people to be incoherent, assuming I'm coherent because I get their deposits, here, I really like I want everybody to be on board. I want everybody, unanimous decisions, that's how I get the most payoff. Okay, and then one more wrinkle that's important is that I'll consider some systems that have an appeal system, and I have like a formal model of what it means to have an appeal. Basically, you put in more resources, a bigger MP, and you wait some time to Ethereum blocks. And you get a new ruling, which ideally, because you put in more resources, is like a better ruling. Not necessarily, but ideally is a better ruling. And that final ruling is used for coherence, payoffs, rewards, and penalties for all the previous rounds. And this is Kleros has an explicit appeal system like this, but this is general enough to cover the system of Ogre. If there's sort of a Schelling-ish system as well. And if you think about waiting extra blocks in proof of work, then you can also look at it in this framework. And so basically, if there's an attack and the victim is unhappy, they put in more resources, it's an appeal, and maybe now in the appeal, the attacker can't lock up enough resources to bribe a bigger panel, so maybe the honest party winds up winning. Okay, so in our model, attackers can do p+epsilon attacks. They can do malicious appeals, like appeals are kind of a double-edged sword, but they can't tamper directly with the votes. They can't like do a denial of service attack on Ethereum or anything like that. And voters are economically rational, and they're either uncoordinated or they'll coordinate in specific ways. Okay, so I can think about, okay, what's the p+epsilon attack in each of these like games? So in each situation, I should just add epsilon to whatever I can get for voting X if X wins. Same, it's like this simple, take the upper left box, add epsilon to get the lower left box. So this sort of like having MP, X, MP, D, et cetera, they're not exactly standardized between these different models because in all three models, they're sort of, they're calibrated so that MP is the total amount of money that the voters can get, like max. But the voters are only guaranteed to get MP, if they, in the redistributive game. In the other two games, they might wind up getting like an aggregate less than MP. But regardless, so we can ask, okay, like how expensive is it to do a p+epsilon attack? What's the worst case scenario for an attacker? That's the first natural question. And we can find an explicit quantities for those. That's not a very hard calculation. And you'll notice that, like, with no appeal, the playoff structure doesn't really matter very much. There's some extra factors of 2. It's pretty much the same, asymptotically, whatever. But if there's an appeal, stuff changes. So here it's like, okay, now I have an appeal. And the big difference here is that square in the redistributive game, like that mi squared. So what this is saying is that, like, asymptotically, the budget required for this attack is much higher in a redistributive game versus a simpler symbiotic game. To the degree that, like, you can plausibly, as you get larger and larger numbers of appeals, more and more people, you can quickly get to the point where the required budget for this attack is like more than the entire value of the Ethereum ecosystem. So that, like, the attacker just cannot lock up enough to do this attack. And that's curious. Why does that happen? Well, it happens for something that I call the lone voice of reason effect. So imagine that I'm in a round and everybody else votes Bob, but I vote Alice. And then an appeal, I'm proven right. Alice wins. Maybe there was a bribe and the attacker couldn't maintain his attack, and in the end, like, people voted honestly. Maybe people were just wrong in the first round, whatever. But so because in a redistributive game, I get the lost deposits of everybody else in my round, and whatever input, whatever fees that were to be shared between the people in my round, I get them all because I was the only person that was right. So if someone is trying to p+epsilon bribe me, they have to give me, if they're going to want it to make it a dominant strategy for me to accept the attack, they have to give me enough so that I'm I get like a jackpot if I'm the lone voice of reason, because I'm getting basically M players times like D lost deposits. So the attacker has to give me like MD plus epsilon in order for it to be a dominant strategy for me to accept the bribe. But the attacker has to do that, like ideally keep every voter on board, so they're locking up M squared-ish resources. So another sort of vein, and a little tie into sort of like how the different types of games do on this other kind of metric. So an idea already introduced by Vitalik Buterin in the blog article was this idea of counter-coordination. It's like, okay, this attacker is attacking our system. What if we somehow coordinate between each other so that we can like try to rip off the attacker, get the bribes he or she is paying in, but then like just narrowly cause the attack to fail. So honesty prevails. We'll all get our coherence rewards, and then we get extra resources from the attacker. We're globally better off. So the people coordinate. The woman on the right doesn't want to be part of the counter coordination, but the other people are like, they deposit into a smart contract. The smart contract tells them how to vote, and then they narrowly cause the attack to fail. And the problem with this, a priori, is that the person who doesn't counter coordinate did better. It's like, okay, we ripped off the attacker, we got some of the attacker's like bribes, and then we split them between each other, but nobody did quite as well as the person who got the full bribe. Which makes sense. Like we each only got a part of the bribe. And indeed, in the blog article, Vitalik argues that already that when you have a simple Schelling game without an appeal system like this, even though globally people are better off by counter coordinating, it's like a kind of prisoner's dilemma. Every individual is better off by taking the bribe. So there's no equilibria that will lead to counter coordination. Again, there's a kind of tipping point thing. If you think that your vote would be the difference between counter coordination succeeding and failing, you might counter coordinate. But barring that, you wouldn't, because you'd rather take the full bribe. And then there's no mixed strategy equilibrium where people will counter coordinate with probability, because you'd rather just take a probability of 0 and probability of taking the bribe of 1, you'll do better off. So that's in the simple game. But in a redistributive Schelling game with appeal, we were able to prove a theorem that says under these assumptions, each vote is controlled by a unique, economically rational entity. There's you have some assumed budget for the attacker, but you have this distribution for what you think the attacker's budget might be. You don't know what it is exactly a priori. The number of votes per round grows according to these reasonable constraints. And then there are a couple of constraints on the parameters. The deposit size is big, sort of relative to p, with the constants depending on the growth of the m's. That's fine because you design a game. You can choose d and p like that. And then finally, a constraint which is not so natural and ideally we get rid of, that epsilon is no bigger than some constant times d. So if epsilon is huge, this theorem doesn't apply, which is not great because the attacker can just make a bigger epsilon. But then epsilon's not very epsilon-y anymore. They're locking up even more. But under these assumptions, there exists a possible counter-coordination and a mixed strategy equilibrium where people are incentivized to counter-coordinate with some positive probability, and you can bound the attacker's chances of winning at strictly less than 1. And there's an explicit bound. And I don't want to spend too much time going into the details of how this works, but basically the idea is that you counter-coordinate over rounds, and the people in the early rounds you just tell to take the bribe, but they all get the lone voice of reason jackpot. But then by sort of signing up for the counter-coordination, what they agree to in the smart contract is they put in some of that, just a little bit of that lone voice of reason jackpot into subsidizing people in later rounds, so that the people in the later rounds are incentivized to not defect and to vote to counter coordinate, causing a narrow defeat for the attacker in the end. And then it kind of gets back to this idea of the tipping point again. I, as the counter coordinator, I'd rather be that guy in the green shirt up in the upper right. I'd rather have the whole lone voice of reason jackpot to myself. But by just having one person take the lone voice, counter coordinating an early round, they get almost the whole lone voice of reason jackpot. But the amount of money they're able to subsidize the later rounds because the lone voice of reason jackpot is so huge is enough to dramatically increase the probability the counter coordination succeeds. So you sort of leverage my sort of probability of being the tipping point. So I may have a small probability of causing the counter coordination to succeed or fail, but the amount of money that I gain by doing that is so big that it's worth it for me to do that with some probability. You can have an explicit example of this. So that's that. So we saw that redistributive games seem to be more resilient both on the sort of budget requirements and the counter coordination. And then we did some sort of experiments/stress tests. So we launched some p+epsilon attacks in the Kleros platform and saw how people reacted. These are all redistributive games because that's what we have deployed. At one point during our an early release of Kleros, we did something we called the Doge pilot, which was an explicitly experimental phase where people would submit these Doge images. And if people submitted a cat, if they could get a cat that was signed off on as a Doge image by the Kleros jurors, they got a reward. So cat images were explicitly hostile, explicitly dishonest. And then we launched some attacks where people was here's a cat image, here's a bribe to vote that it's a Doge image. And we saw how people reacted. And for the most part, people did not, these weren't huge bribes. These were on the order of $10 max. But people didn't take them. As you can sort of see in this table. This isn't a huge number of people because ultimately there were only there weren't that many active participants in the Kleros platform at the time. They were drawn with a probability that was correlated to how many tokens they had. So people drawing super small participants was kind of hard. So there were a whole bunch of people that got drawn multiple times. There were 20 some odd unique individuals. But if you think of it as a stress test for how how given cryptoeconomic system might be resistant to this kind of attack. It's more useful to think of the individual unit here as a token. You might imagine, okay, would a given token that has some probability of being drawn as a voter accept a given kind of bribe in a given kind of circumstances? And from that perspective, you could show with astronomically low probability that it is very unlikely that 50% of the token pool would accept these kinds of bribes. But because this is, I would say this is very limited to the kinds of pool of people we had. This was early days of our project. The people that were involved were enthusiastic believers in the project. So there's it depends a lot on the culture of the people you're trying to attack. And I would say that this is a stress test. It's something that maybe you should redo periodically to sort of gauge, okay, how vulnerable are we now? How vulnerable are we now? And get a sense over time rather than having universal truths being drawn from this kind of experiment. Why didn't people take the bribe? Well, maybe there were high cognitive costs to understand the attack. You'd have to read the Vitalik Buterin blog article. Maybe you have to look at the code. These attacks were all enforced by a smart contract, but smart contracts can have bugs. And if you're taking a smart contract from an attacker, they may be trying to rip you out. There may be a bug or a backdoor they know about. Maybe the attack may be trustless, but only if you're a developer who can analyze the contract. It's possible our pool of voters was just too altruistic, as I said before. So that's the kind of thing you want to kind of touch base on from time to time. If you say, okay, maybe there's some and also in terms of moral costs in addition to cognitive costs, several of our voters explicitly said in feedback, oh, the bribes are too small, it's not worth it for me. So people have maybe some built-in cost for both this cost of analyzing the smart contract, the bribing smart contract, and then also the cost of betraying their morality. You can model that in. It's okay, in my payoff matrix, I just have -m for taking the bribe. What kind of result does that give now? and you can show that it's no longer a dominant, but like given these constraints, epsilons less than m's less than p plus d, it is no longer a dominant strategy to accept the bribe. There's like a mixed strategy now. And you can talk about like what the probability of the attacker winning in that is. We show that in the paper. I've said a fair number of things about like, oh, redistributive games, they seem more robust against p plus epsilon attacks than the other kinds of games. But like on some level, the attacker could adapt. This idea that the attacker has to pay out the max bribe or like the max amount of the lone voice of reason jackpot plus epsilon to everybody seems like a bit of an overkill. Because like if you're paying a big enough bribe so that no one will ever defect. That it's a dominant strategy to not defect. But what if I'm like, okay, like if a few of you defect, it's okay as long as I still win. So there are a couple of ways that the attacker could kind of adapt. Maybe they could only offer the bribe in the last round, so you can't appeal beyond. Then you don't necessarily know which round is the last round. Maybe they offer like a capped bribe, where they're like, okay, I'll bribe you p plus epsilon up to cap. And in the paper, we analyzed both of those approaches. They're better for the attacker than not doing that, but they sort of like muddy the waters. If you're a voter and you're like, okay, well, I already had cognitive costs in the old case, now there's like a cap, it's no longer a dominant strategy, it's even hard, like a priori it's even a higher cognitive cost, but like further research would be useful here to sort of further explore the possibilities of p plus epsilon-esque kinds of attacks. So I comments on those approaches. We did, one of our experiments was a last round only attack. We have some results on the equilibrium state of capped attacks. So just to conclude, we explored the kinds of different structures of Schelling games and their effectiveness and their results on the effectiveness of p plus epsilon attacks. We identified examples that fit into these structures. We calculated the budget requirements for different kinds of attacks. We proved that there is counter coordination can be economically rational in the redistributive setting. We did some sort of stress tests, and then we looked at ways the attacker could adapt. So if people have any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
Yes, please.
Okay, super interesting, thanks. So my question is about what you kind of require the attacker to do. So you're assuming that the p plus epsilon attacker is going to do this via a smart contract, and therefore needs to actually lock a to make a credible attack, has to actually lock up the funds ahead of time, and you made the argument that okay, since you have this like square term, then the attacker can't possibly lock up that much. But like, couldn't the attacker could be like a real world entity, and they could make some kind of real world, not 100% guaranteed promise that like, look, you like vote this way that I want, and I'll probably pay you, but hopefully I won't have to pay anyone because everyone will move this way. So like that seems to reduce the budget requirement for the attacker quite a bit. Any thought on that? Yeah,
I mean that's certainly true. Like there's an extra like level of cognitive costs there for people that are like, well, I don't know, the attacker's this isn't going to pay me. Maybe that like weights whether I think this is really a dominant strategy to take the bribe. But like moreover, like if you don't think there's going to be an appeal, if you're like, okay, there's this attacker's offering me a bribe, I think this is probably going to be the last round. Or there's not going to be too many rounds, and the attacker probably has enough money to cover whatever appeals they're going to be. Yeah, totally. But if in the back of your mind you're like, there could be an appeal here, and like I don't think the attacker has enough money to lock up for that appeal. That can like impact your reasoning, because like at the end of the day, if everybody else in your round takes the bribe and you don't, you have this jackpot waiting for you. So.
The thing about, the reason Schelling points are so interesting in this space is that they're a study of coordination with rationality, but without communication, right? And a thing that just has kept coming up again and again in the talks this afternoon is no one's really talking about expectations or common knowledge, or the sort of I know that you know that I know sort of thing. And I think it's a huge thing that's overlooked in this space. Is we're really focusing on the strategic rationality of an attack. And a lot of the vulnerability that comes up is when I have uncertainty about what you know that I know, and so on. Do you have any thoughts about the role of expectations in this?
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly interesting, and that makes a more rich model. So one point that's sort of like unexpected in the sort of proof of the theorem is that like here. So this assumes, I mean, maybe this should be like an additional, like one of the like lines. It assumes that, maybe it fits into economically rational, that all the voters know this attack is happening, and they know that all the voters know there's going to be an attack. If there are if there's like a block of voters that just don't know there's an attack, they're just blissfully going along, it's like, whatever, I'm playing a game, I don't know there's an attack, then you don't expect them to take the bribe. You expect them just to vote honestly. But then that reduces the lone voice of reason jackpot for anyone who does decides to not take the bribe, because it's closer to a 50-50 situation. There's not like these huge like amounts being redistributed over like one person. So the fact that like some people might not be aware of the attack, as long as they're not like too many, actually makes the attack more dangerous. So there are interesting questions there.
Yeah, my question is, one of the criticisms of proof-of-stake systems is that voters can costlessly mine on alternative histories, and I wondered what your thoughts are on the resistance of this scheme to that kind of attack.
Yeah, so for the Symbiotic game that I showed for the proposed ETH2, so like that specific proof-of-stake system, so I mean you don't have you're more closer in terms of the budget requirements and the counter coordination to the simple game. There are these finality guarantees. So there's also not like an appeal system, or there's not, you can't appeal in sort of the same way that you can in proof of work by taking like a really long chain. There's some divergence there from the kinds of models that I've considered.
So the appeal system means you can't have a secret alternative history and still appeal it. Is that a fair characterization of that?
Yeah. So so this sort of secret sidechain mining or something is limited because you have these finality guarantees, but then that also prevents sort of the defenses, but the double-edged defenses that we get from the appeal system here. So they're good and bad in terms of the finality guarantees. Did that answer your question?
I'm still trying to work it out in my own head, really.
All right, look, if there's no more questions, thank you, William. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation, and thank you to all the speakers that we've had.